Welcome back to 5 Acres Honey Farm. I'm Tara Lynn, and I'm sharing the results of my first honey lab analysis report. I had a really interesting result. I only sent my honey out for testing out of my own curiosity, but now this experience is prompting me to plan on doing this every year. And I'm also exploring some other lab tests. So just to share, my honey is a rose honey, which is allegedly very rare, and I'll share a bit more about that in a moment. But I wanted to show you, I've got a jar, which I call bottle 0, from every honey harvest that I've had here in Pittsboro. And my Pittsboro, North Carolina apiary, I started in 2017, and you generally don't harvest that first year, so I have bottles from 2018 to this year. And since I've never tested my honey before, there is a possibility that this year's analysis from the lab could reflect on what the bees have foraged on in the past. There is quite a variation in color over the past several years. And in 2020, I actually had no honey harvest. So I have actually an empty bottle there. It was a very strange year. And the honey lab analysis report showed that although rose is the primary nectar source, which, I don't know what kind of roses, and that could indicate that the bees were maybe foraging on multiflora rose, the invasive floral source, but there's no way of knowing that. It also showed the next largest content was poison oak or poison ivy. And I'll show you the breakdown of how that chart is laid out. The top 3 nectar sources are rose, poison oak, and lilac. From what I've researched, there's really no concern about the bees foraging on poison oak or poison ivy. The substance that is in the leaf is actually not in a finished honey product, so there is no risk of any kind of irritation or any kind of reaction because of that. So that's a good thing to hear. For the rose honey, I share a little bit about this in the post that I'm linking to, but I had been Googling about rose honey because I had never really heard of it, and certainly in our region, tulip poplar is credited with being the primary nectar source, and as you saw in the chart, there is not a drop of tulip poplar in this spring harvest. And the poplar were blooming and the weather was amenable for foraging, and they did not really obviously bring anything in based on the lab report. Since I had never heard of rose honey, of course the first thing I do is Google it, and I don't really find much information about it. There are references to some retailers that sell a rose infused honey. So you can take any honey that you have and you can put rose petals in it and let that infuse, and you can create your own rose infused honey. But this is actually a lab analysis of the honey content itself, so what the bees have produced and what they foraged on. So this is a pure rose honey and not a rose infused honey, which I couldn't find any details about. So I decided to ask ChatGPT, what can you tell me about rose honey? And pretty much roses are not notorious for producing high volumes of nectar, so they're not really credited with providing a monofloral nectar source for honeybees. So they are more looked at for high pollen production, but when it comes to nectar, there's generally such a low amount of nectar produced that it might be nominal in an actual harvest of honey, and that you may not be able to detect it. So for there to be such a high volume, more than half of the content of the honey is rose honey, then that's indicating that they have quite an abundant resource of rose nectar in the area. Originally, ChatGPT, was saying this really isn't possible because roses just don't really produce much nectar and rose honey doesn't exist. So I followed up with a prompt, and I attached the lab analysis report, and I asked it to tell me what this report means. And it was really interesting to see that this is quite an anomaly, that it's generally, as I described, not a high nectar producer, or roses are not a high nectar producer. So it's pretty uncommon to have a honey that has such a high nectar content from that particular floral source. Just satisfying my own curiosity by having the honey tested, finding out this really unique honey is here, and now I'm curious, is this an every year occurrence? And given that it is so rare, based on the research that I've been doing, I could be charging more, which would allow me to fold the cost of the lab analysis up into the cost into the honey jars, so that way it wouldn't cost me anything out of pocket. It'll just be absorbed by folks who are enjoying the honey. And it's also prompting me then to probably, most likely, maybe definitely hold my honey harvest next year, which I haven't done before intentionally. So instead of offering the honey for sale as soon as I pull it off the hives, I will most likely be pulling it off and bottling it, and then waiting for the lab analysis to come back so that I can either label it as a varietal, or if they don't happen to harvest rose honey next year and it's maybe some other varietal, but I'll be able to market it in a clearer way. And I wanted to share a few things that I learned about the honey sampling process. So I'll include a picture of what the sample tubes look like. You'll need to fill two 50 milliliter tubes to get your honey tested. I use the Honey and Pollen Diagnostics Lab at Penn State. And the way that their program works as of this recording is you fill out a form on their website and they will send you a test kit. And there's nothing, you don't have to pay for that at this point. They just send it out to you. And depending on how many tests you plan to do, let them know when you fill out the form. So I knew I was gonna try out doing my Pittsboro honey, and then I was going to wait and see if I was going to get a good harvest in the mountains, and I was going to do a few tests from there because I wanted to sample a sourwood honey if I saw something that I thought to be sourwood coming in. So I did send 2 samples in from the mountains. Those are not back yet. So just as far as the timeline, the samples take 2 months to come back after the lab receives it. So if you're kind of dragging your feet with sending your samples in, that's going to delay getting the results. And once you get the test kit from the lab, they include instructions on how to fill up your tubes and how to seal them properly. And at that point, you'll be mailing it back to the lab. So they will provide a prepaid envelope, and you will put a check in your envelope with your honey samples, and that gets sent back out to them. When they receive it, they'll send you an email and confirm that they received it, and then you'll wait about 2 months to get the results. And the results come by email attached as a PDF. I really liked seeing the pie chart breakdown of all the nectar sources and just being surprised because there's very tiny amount of clover in there. So it was nothing that I was expecting overall. There was no poplar, no clover, nothing that anyone talks about in this region. So I'm curious if my mountain honey samples will surprise me in a similar way and be something completely unexpected. But we'll have to wait and see. I sent the honey samples for the mountains in at the end of August. So I'm not expecting to get the results for maybe another week or 2. So when those come in, I will do a follow-up video and share what those results are. Something that I thought was really interesting, particularly for this to happen this year and to get a rose honey report back, is I've shared before, this jar doesn't have it because generally on the jars that I keep, I don't really waste a label. But on the back of my honey jars, I include a poem. So every year I write some new poems and include them on the honey jars. And I'm also a short story writer. And this year I published a short story collection, my first one. And as you see, it's Rose Window. So I have some backstory behind why I titled it and why a rose window surfaces in one of the stories. And part of that is because of my family history research, which inspired the stories. Roses come up in my family history over and over and over again. I've had relatives live on Rose Street. multiple of them. My grandfather's girlfriend was named Rose. There were other instances as I was visiting some family graves. They were in the rose section of the cemetery, or I found some graves that have roses on them. And it keeps coming up in really strange ways, very unexpectedly. And so of course, unexpectedly again, to get, in the very year that I published my book, then to get a lab analysis with rose honey, it just seems really fitting, and it just feels like the right time for the book and the right time for the honey and all of that too. So I just wanted to share that little tidbit because that was something that that stood out to me right away as soon as I saw the lab report. I have recently attended the Real Organic conference about 2 weeks ago. I have a video that kind of recaps some of the big things that I learned there, and I also have a post about it. I'll link to both in the description. And one of the themes that I heard a lot at the conference is getting testing done. So for different things, not related to honey, but just overall across different industries, I'm seeing a lot of testing. So I'm seeing testing for nutrient density. I'm seeing testing for fraud and analyzing for contaminants. So now I'm researching different labs that I could use where I could test the honey for glyphosate and PFAS and herbicides and other contaminants. So that way, if I find some affordable labs, then I would be able to sell my honey as lab tested and free of these contaminants and so on and so on. So that's something else that I'm exploring. And if you have any experience having your honey tested for those purposes, I would love to learn which labs you used, what you thought of that process. Please comment and reach out. And as I research these different providers and try out some of these labs, I will keep sharing more. So thanks.